Prince Edward just pulled off something that, quite frankly, nobody inside the palace walls saw coming, and the way he did it is almost more fascinating than what he actually won. On March 25, 2026, a quiet, unprecedented legal earthquake shook the British monarchy. It wasn't loud, there were no public statements, no dramatic televised announcements, and no shouting matches in the corridors of power. Instead, it happened in writing, a clean, definitive, and undeniable checkmate delivered straight to the king's desk. Prince Edward, long considered the quietest, most low-profile member of the royal family, stood his ground against his older brother, King Charles III, and forced the crown to back down completely. To understand how staggering this victory really was, you have to understand the fundamental assumption King Charles had been operating under for years. When Charles acceded to the throne, he did so with a very specific, deeply entrenched mindset. He believed, as many monarchs before him had, that being king granted him ultimate, sweeping authority over the business of the royal family. In Charles's mind, the crown wasn't just a symbol, it was the ultimate administrative pen. He assumed he had the final say over royal property, the redistribution of historic titles, the management of family estates, and the financial structures that governed how his relatives lived. For years, Charles envisioned a streamlined, modernized monarchy. It was a vision built on centralizing control, cutting operational costs, and reallocating royal real estate as he saw fit. He operated under the belief that if an estate sat on crown land, or if a title was granted by royal prerogative, it ultimately belonged to him to review, alter, or reclaim. It was a grand, sweeping view of sovereign power. And on March 25, 2026, King Charles found out, in cold, legally binding text, that he was dead wrong. What makes this entire situation so deeply compelling is that Edward didn't just win a family argument, he exposed a massive, fundamental misunderstanding at the absolute top of the monarchy regarding what a king can and cannot legally do. Charles had assumed that historic tradition and sovereign authority would always override individual family agreements. He assumed that when the king asks for something back, the family simply complies. He failed to realize that Prince Edward was the one person in the royal family who had quietly, meticulously kept every single receipt. Where others relied on verbal promises, informal royal understandings, or the fleeting goodwill of the reigning monarch, Edward operated like a corporate strategist. Over 3 decades, he quietly documented every single agreement, every financial transaction, every lease extension, and every personal letter signed by his late parents. When the moment of confrontation arrived, Charles didn't just find himself up against his younger brother. He found himself up against an airtight, bulletproof legal archive that his own legal team couldn't break. To see how that archive was built, you have to go back to the very foundation of Edward's position, the estate that started this entire war, Bagshot Park. To the outside observer, Bagshot Park might just look like another grand historic building, but inside the machinery of the royal family, it is a massive, 120-room Tudor Gothic mansion sitting on 51 acres of prime land inside Windsor Great Park. It is not just a family home, it is the physical seat of the Dukedom of Edinburgh. Long before her passing in September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II made a series of decisions that were extraordinarily deliberate. She had watched the internal dynamics of her family shift over decades. She saw the rising public and political pressure surrounding royal finances, properties, and titles. Most importantly, she knew that once she was gone, the dynamic between her children would change drastically. Elizabeth knew exactly what she wanted locked in before her reign ended. The Dukedom of Edinburgh was to go to Prince Edward. That was never intended to be up for debate. The title had defined her late husband, Prince Philip, for more than 7 decades. It represented his life's work, his legacy, and his dedication to the crown. Elizabeth made sure that title would pass to Edward, the one son who had stayed steady, avoided high-profile scandals, and quietly carried out his duties without bringing harm to the institution. That promise was officially fulfilled in April 2023, when King Charles formally granted Edward the Dukedom of Edinburgh. If the story had ended there, the monarchy might have moved forward in peace. But the title was only half of what Edward was meant to inherit. The other half, the structural anchor of that title, was Bagshot Park. In her final years, Queen Elizabeth II signed a formal letter of intent that tied the Bagshot Park estate directly to the Edinburgh title for Edward's lifetime. That document was not signed in isolation. It was witnessed by Prince Philip himself as his health was declining. Philip knew precisely how the palace bureaucracy worked behind closed doors. He knew that without explicit, written documentation, a title without a secure, independent base left its holder vulnerable to the whims of whoever sat on the throne next. Elizabeth and Philip locked it in together. The title and the physical estate were meant to remain unified. It was a clear, documented decision backed by the monarch's direct signature and witnessed by the Duke of Edinburgh himself. However, after Elizabeth passed away, a completely different operational philosophy took root inside Buckingham Palace. King Charles's drive for a slimmed-down monarchy was no longer just a theoretical concept. By 2026, it had transformed into direct action. Financial audits were commissioned, long-standing royal leases were brought under intense scrutiny, and subtle behind-the-scenes pressure was applied across the family to consolidate assets back under central crown control. And very quickly, Bagshot Park, a grand, immensely valuable 51-acre asset sitting right in Windsor, became a prime target for Charles's restructuring planners. The reality of what Edward was suddenly facing was stark. He had waited his entire life to step into the role his father had built. He received the dukedom in 2023, stepping up to take on an expanded workload as a senior working royal. Yet, within just 3 years, the very institution he was serving began trying to dismantle the legal and residential foundation that gave his position its weight. Without Bagshot Park, the Dukedom of Edinburgh would be reduced to little more than a title on paper, a name without a base, a grand royal status stripped of its physical independence and left entirely reliant on palace management. What Charles's advisors overlooked, however, was the history of Bagshot Park itself, and precisely how much of his own life, effort, and private wealth Prince Edward had poured into the ground beneath it. To fully grasp why King Charles found himself backed into a legal corner, you have to look at the paperwork, and specifically at the deliberate decisions Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip made long before the crown ever changed hands. Queen Elizabeth II was a monarch who rarely acted on impulse. Every decision she made regarding family property, royal titles, and personal inheritances was executed with surgical foresight. In her final years, she saw the storm gathering on the horizon. She understood that her passing would trigger a massive structural overhaul within the institution, and she knew that junior royals would come under intense pressure as the royal estate sought to consolidate power and cut operational costs. That is precisely why she signed a formal letter of intent tying Bagshot Park directly to the Dukedom of Edinburgh for Edward's lifetime. This wasn't just a mother looking out for her youngest child. It was a monarch establishing a binding line of succession for one of the royal family's most significant seats. And standing right beside her when that document was signed was Prince Philip. Philip had spent over 70 years watching how the palace machinery operated behind closed doors. He had watched the bureaucracy move quietly, efficiently, and often ruthlessly against members of the family who were no longer deemed central to the core narrative. He knew that without explicit, legally backed paperwork, Edward would be left exposed the moment the reign ended. So Philip put his own signature on that document as a witness, locking it into the royal archives. The title and the estate were meant to stand together as a unified inheritance. Fast forward to 2026. Under King Charles III, the long-discussed modernization of the monarchy had ceased to be a vague slogan. It became an aggressive administrative campaign. Charles's team began conducting sweeping financial reviews across all royal properties. Leases were pulled, maintenance budgets were audited, and behind closed doors, pressure began to mount on non-core family members to vacate grand estates. At the top of that review list sat Bagshot Park, a staggering 51-acre estate featuring a 120-room Tudor Gothic mansion inside Windsor Great Park, valued at an estimated £30 million. If the Crown Estate could reclaim Bagshot Park, it could be repurposed, commercialized, or leased out at massive profit to bolster royal revenues. What was framed to the public as a prudent, cost-saving review of royal housing was, in reality, a direct attempt to strip Prince Edward of his physical base and weaken the independent standing of his household. What Charles and his advisors failed to calculate, however, was the paper trail Edward had spent nearly 3 decades building. When Edward first took on Bagshot Park in March 1998, it was not the pristine, luxurious royal residence it is today. The property had been occupied for decades by the Royal Army Chaplains Department. When the military vacated the site in 1996, the building was worn out, structurally neglected, and functionally obsolete. The Crown Estate didn't even want to keep it in the royal portfolio. There were active commercial proposals to turn the historic mansion into a private conference center or a commercial hotel. Instead, the Crown Estate entered into a lease agreement with Prince Edward. Under the initial terms signed in 1998, Edward agreed to a 50-year lease at a modest initial rent of £5,000 a year, but that low rent came with a massive financial obligation. Edward was required to restore the entire, decaying estate immediately. He didn't rely on state handouts or public tax dollars to do it. Total repairs reached nearly £3 million. While the Crown Estate covered a portion of the structural restoration, Edward poured £1.36 million of his own private capital into the property, money he had earned independently before transitioning into a full-time working royal. Once those extensive renovations were complete, the agreement kicked into its next phase. Edward's rent was dramatically increased to £90,000 a year, an amount formally audited and verified by the National Audit Office as full market value. And here is where Edward's paper trail exposed a glaring double standard at the very heart of the royal family. While Edward was paying £90,000 a year in full market value rent for Bagshot Park, his brother, Prince Andrew, was residing at Royal Lodge under vastly different, highly subsidized conditions that repeatedly raised eyebrows within government oversight committees. One brother followed every financial rule, paid his way, and maintained his estate to national heritage standards using private funds. The other did not. Yet when the Palace Modernization Committee launched its crackdown in 2026, it turned its sights on the brother who had done everything strictly by the book. Edward didn't stop at paying market rent, either. He played the long game. In 2007, recognizing that future palace leadership might eventually try to alter lease terms, Edward made a decisive financial move. Operating through his private corporate entity, Eclipse Nominees Limited, Edward paid a massive £5 million upfront to the Crown Estate to extend his lease from 50 years to a staggering 150 years. That £5 million payment fundamentally changed the legal character of his tenure. It converted his residence from a temporary royal allocation into a long-term, legally protected asset. Under the binding terms of that 2007 lease extension, Edward secured full commercial control, including the legal right to sell the lease on the open market and retain the financial profits. So when Charles's advisors stepped in during early 2026, attempting to pressure Edward into surrendering or renegotiating Bagshot Park, they weren't dealing with a junior royal occupying a grace and favor apartment on a whim. They were attempting to break a binding, 150-year commercial contract backed by a £5 million upfront payment, millions in private restoration receipts, and a signed letter of intent from Queen Elizabeth II witnessed by Prince Philip. Edward had built an impenetrable financial fortress around his home, but as Charles would soon learn, Bagshot Park was only the first front in a much larger, deeply personal war. While the battle over Bagshot Park was escalating behind closed financial doors, an even sharper, far more personal intrusion was launched directly into Prince Edward's household. This time, the target wasn't real estate. It was something deeply intimate, wearing the disguise of official palace protocol, a targeted audit sent directly from the office of Queen Camilla earlier in 2026, before any formal legal documents were officially exchanged over property leases. Officials acting on behalf of Queen Camilla arrived with a quiet, firm instruction. It was framed under the polite umbrella of a national heritage check, a routine jewelry audit designed to catalog historic assets held within the family, but its actual purpose was singular and unmistakable. Someone had come to count, question, and ultimately reclassify the heirloom jewelry that Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had worn as her own for over 25 years. At the absolute center of that audit sat one irreplaceable piece, the Anthem Tiara. This was not a piece randomly assigned out of a vault for state dinners. The Anthem Tiara was commissioned personally by Queen Elizabeth II for Sophie's wedding to Prince Edward in June 1999. Constructed by the crown jeweler, Garrard, it was crafted using 4 distinct antique elements, shaped in a honeysuckle design, taken directly from the private collection of Queen Victoria. For nearly 2 decades, it served as the core piece of Sophie's royal identity. Because Sophie was never given open access to the grand state tiaras in the manner of other senior royal women, the Anthem Tiara became her signature crown. Queen Camilla's legal strategists constructed an argument framed in strict institutional language. Because the tiara incorporated gold and gemstones originating from Queen Victoria's historic holdings, they argued it technically qualified as crown property. Therefore, under the proposed centralizing guidelines, the tiara ought to be surrendered to the central royal vault at Buckingham Palace. Sophie would no longer own her wedding tiara. Instead, she would be required to formally request permission from the central household whenever she wished to wear it. The intent was obvious. To strip Sophie of her wedding tiara was to strip the Edinburgh household of its autonomy, reducing their standing and leaving them entirely beholden to central command. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden legal battles shaping the royal household, make sure to hit the subscribe button below and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. What Queen Camilla's advisors failed to realize was that Prince Edward had anticipated this exact maneuver decades in advance, and he was holding 2 devastating counterclaims. First came the physical evidence, a legal deed of gift executed and signed by Queen Elizabeth II in June 1999. Edward's legal team pulled the document directly from their archive. The deed explicitly categorized the Anthem Tiara not as an institutional loan, not as a shared crown asset, and not as property held in trust, but as a private, absolute personal wedding gift to Sophie. Elizabeth had deliberately executed the deed to ensure that no future monarch or palace administration could ever challenge her daughter-in-law's personal ownership. If that deed of gift was the primary defense, Edward's second counterattack was a brilliant legal trap built on intellectual property. Back in 1999, Edward had personally collaborated with royal jewelers to design a matching set of black and white pearl jewelry for Sophie, a necklace and matching earrings specifically styled to sit in complete visual harmony with the Anthem Tiara. While the physical precious materials were funded through traditional channels, Prince Edward personally held the formal design rights to the entire suite. His legal team laid down a ruthless argument. The Anthem Tiara and the custom pearl suite constituted a single, indivisible artistic entity under copyright law. Reclassifying or removing the tiara would violate Edward's protected design rights over the integrated suite. You could not seize the crown without infringing upon the prince's personal intellectual property. When those legal defenses failed to immediately halt the audit, Edward's team dropped all diplomatic subtlety. They delivered an ultimatum to Buckingham Palace with a firm deadline. End of day, March 25, 2026. The directive was absolute. If the claim on the Anthem Tiara was not formally dropped and wiped from the audit logs by nightfall, Edward's lawyers were prepared to release private, unpublished letters written by Queen Elizabeth II. These were not standard royal missives. They were intimate, candid letters in which Elizabeth II explicitly stated her personal wishes for Sophie to retain complete, unchallengeable control over her personal jewelry portfolio. But crucially, according to those familiar with the contents, those letters contained far more than instructions about tiaras. They contained Queen Elizabeth II's private, unfiltered thoughts regarding Camilla, documenting the long, cold distance, the years of hesitation, and the deep institutional reservations that defined their relationship for decades. Releasing those letters would do far more than defend a tiara. It would instantly obliterate decades of delicate public relations work that had successfully transformed Camilla from an unpopular figure into queen consort. It threatened to lay bare the late queen's true feelings, reigniting a historical narrative that Buckingham Palace had spent 20 years trying to bury. By the afternoon of March 25th, the ultimatum had landed with maximum force. The legal dossier was bulletproof. The intellectual property trap was sprung, and the threat of catastrophic personal exposure was sitting directly on the king's desk. Yet, as tense as the paper war had become inside the legal offices, the decisive blow would not come from a solicitor's brief. It was about to walk directly through the door of Buckingham Palace in the person of Princess Anne. While Edward's legal team was building an unyielding paper wall, the decisive blow was not struck by solicitors or corporate archivists. It occurred inside a private sitting room at Buckingham Palace on the afternoon of March 25th, when Princess Anne walked in to face her older brother, King Charles III. To understand why Princess Anne's sudden intervention completely shattered the palace's strategic momentum, you have to understand the quiet, profound transformation that had occurred between Anne and Sophie over the preceding 5 years. Historically, the Princess Royal kept a respectful, almost professional distance from her younger brother's wife. Anne was famously unsentimental, notoriously pragmatic, and guarded when it came to royal newcomers, but that distance evaporated between April 2021 and September 2022, the brutal 17-month window that saw the deaths of both Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II. In those final fragile months of Elizabeth's life, Anne and Sophie were at Windsor constantly. They stood shoulder to shoulder through shared, agonizing grief, managing daily affairs and comforting the elderly monarch. Anne watched as Sophie, who had lost her own mother years earlier, cared for the Queen with fierce, selfless devotion. By the time of the late Queen's funeral, the quiet dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Anne no longer viewed Sophie merely as a sister-in-law, but as an indispensable pillar of the family, someone who had earned her place, protected the crown, and suffered the same devastating losses. So when Queen Camilla's office launched an audit targeting Sophie's wedding tiara, and when palace administrators sought to strip Bagshot Park from Edward, Princess Anne didn't see routine modernization. She saw a calculated, unprovoked assault on the people her mother had explicitly chosen to protect. When Anne entered the king's private room at Buckingham Palace on the afternoon of March 25th, there were no polite pleasantries, no administrative delays, and no diplomatic preamble. She bypassed the advisors, stepped past the private secretaries, and confronted Charles directly. She immediately challenged the core logic of his entire administrative campaign, attacking the very foundation of royal authority. Anne laid out a warning that struck at the heart of Charles's legitimacy as sovereign. "If our mother's signature on a lease or a deed of gift is worth nothing today," she told him, "then your signature will be worth even less tomorrow." The argument was devastating in its simplicity. A monarch's authority does not exist in a vacuum. It relies entirely on the sacred continuity of the crown's word. If a reigning king could retroactively invalidate signed legal deeds, binding contracts, and personal gifts executed by the sovereign who preceded him, he would permanently undermine the legal weight of his own royal assent. By trying to dismantle Elizabeth II's final directives, Charles was unknowingly dismantling the legal authority of his own reign. Anne made it unmistakably clear that she did not view the dispute over Bagshot Park and the attack on the Anthem Tiara as separate administrative issues. Both were backed by Queen Elizabeth II's direct signature, both were secured by binding documentation, and both were being targeted under the exact same pretext of institutional restructuring. Then, Princess Anne delivered her primary counteroffensive, a threat so direct and strategically lethal that it instantly changed the balance of power inside the palace. If the central administration refused to halt its targeted audits of Edward and Sophie's household, Anne promised to immediately initiate a full, meticulous, and public audit of Queen Camilla's private household expenses, staffing allocations, and estate funding. As the most notoriously frugal, hardworking, and disciplined member of the royal family, a royal whose own financial record was entirely pristine, Anne possessed the absolute credibility required to execute such a threat. An independent financial audit led by the Princess Royal into the Queen's household allocations would have been institutional poison, exposing internal expenditures to unprecedented internal scrutiny. Finally, Anne addressed the subtle pressure that had been mounting behind the scenes regarding Prince Edward's children, James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor. Palace strategists had been quietly floating plans to push James and Louise into private, non-protected status early, effectively stripping them of secondary royal support structures and isolating Edward's line from the wider institutional umbrella. Anne shut the initiative down on the spot. Having famously chosen to raise her own children, Peter and Zara, without royal titles decades earlier, Anne knew precisely what that choice entailed. But as she pointedly reminded Charles, that had been her personal choice as a parent. It was not an administrative mandate forced upon her by a sovereign's office. She declared that any decisions regarding the future status of James and Louise belonged exclusively to Edward and Sophie, and that any attempt to force the issue from Buckingham Palace would be met with open, uncompromising opposition. By the time Princess Anne walked out of that private room, the political landscape inside the royal household was unrecognizable. Charles was no longer dealing with a simple administrative review or a quiet property adjustment. He was facing an ironclad legal archive built by Prince Edward, a devastating intellectual property trap around the royal jewels, the threat of published letters exposing historical tensions, and an aggressive, unified stand led by Princess Anne. The king's legal advisors had already reached their quiet conclusion. The legal position of the Edinburgh household was completely unbreakable. Now, with his sister holding the line, Charles was left facing an absolute checkmate. Confronted with Princess Anne's direct warning, an airtight legal archive, and the very real threat of catastrophic personal disclosures, King Charles III did what any pragmatic leader must when backed into an absolute corner. He turned the entire file over to his private legal counsel. The verdict returned by the king's own legal team was swift, total, and completely unambiguous. After meticulously reviewing the 1998 lease, the 2007 lease extension funded by Edward's £5 million payment, the signed deed of gift for the Anthem Tiara, and the late Queen's letter of intent witnessed by Prince Philip, the solicitors delivered their formal conclusion. Prince Edward's legal standing was unbreakable. Royal authority, sovereign prerogative, and administrative desires could not override legally binding commercial contracts or valid deeds of gift. Charles had lost the fight. Late on the evening of March 25, 2026, the surrender was quietly formalized in writing. A cold, formal communication was issued directly from the office of the Master of the Jewel House to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. The short note contained no apology and no administrative commentary. It simply confirmed that the Anthem Tiara remained under her exclusive private ownership. Simultaneously, the palace's financial review into Bagshot Park was terminated quietly without public ceremony. Officially, palace sources attributed the decision to a recognition of the Edinburgh household's long-standing stewardship of the estate. But inside the corridors of power, everyone understood the reality. The crown had tested its strength against Prince Edward, and the crown had been forced to back down. Yet, while the legal victories were absolute, the permanent damage left in their wake was immense. The personal relationship between King Charles III and Prince Edward was fundamentally altered. What was once a quiet fraternal bond became distant, cold, and strictly functional. According to palace insiders, when Charles subsequently reached out to request a private, unscripted family meeting at Bagshot Park to smooth over the tension, Prince Edward firmly declined. His response was unequivocal. He would only meet with his older brother if his full legal team was present in the room. Edward was no longer operating as a younger brother relying on family trust. He was operating as a sovereign peer, protecting his household's independence. This quiet war permanently fractured the internal power balance at the top of the British monarchy, splitting the family into two distinct operational blocks. The central power base, operating out of Buckingham Palace, centered entirely around King Charles III and Queen Camilla, pushing for central control, streamlined resources, and total administrative dominance. The alignment, a formidable internal counterweight comprising Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and Sophie, supported quietly from the wings by Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, a group determined to honor past inheritances, protect personal autonomy, and prevent central overreach. Perhaps the most profound impact of this clash lies in the lesson passed down to the next generation, specifically to James, Earl of Wessex. One day, James will inherit the Dukedom of Edinburgh, carrying the historic title once held by his grandfather and father, but he will inherit it with a realistic, unvarnished understanding of the institution. He watched his father fight a silent, methodical war against his own family, using contracts, property law, and meticulous preparation. He learned early that the institution that grants titles and privileges can just as easily try to reclaim them the moment power shifts. It is a lesson that instills caution over blind loyalty, a mindset that will shape how he navigates his royal standing for the rest of his life. The battle for Bagshot Park and the Anthem Tiara may be over on paper, but the internal balance of power inside the royal family has been rewritten forever. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think Prince Edward was completely justified in using strict legal tactics against his own brother, or should he have handled this privately within the family? Was King Charles right to attempt to centralize royal assets to modernize the monarchy, or did he overstep his authority by targeting his family's personal inheritances? With Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and Prince William quietly forming an internal alignment, how do you see the future of the monarchy playing out under King Charles's reign? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. We read every single one. If you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the real palace updates. Thank you for watching.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.